The girl didn't flinch when Judge Voss called her a bitch. She didn't flinch when the handcuffs clicked around her wrists at 6:47 that morning, when the gallery laughed at the cheap blazer she wore, when Kessler's attorney called her a delusional, attention-seeking nobody in his opening statement. She just sat there at the defense table, hands folded, eyes forward, expression carrying the particular blankness that people who don't know better mistake for resignation. People who do know better recognize it as something else entirely. Her name appeared in no public database. Her photograph existed in no searchable archive. 3 intelligence agencies on 2 continents had spent the better part of a decade maintaining her non-existence as official policy. But the file in CIA Director Marcus Webb's briefcase, the one he was currently carrying through the marble corridor of the United States federal courthouse, was about to make her very, very real. And the people in that courtroom were not going to enjoy the introduction. The arrest happened on a Tuesday, which Evelyn Chun had always considered the most dishonest day of the week. It happened at 6:42 in the morning, which was also dishonest. Early enough that the neighbors wouldn't see, late enough that the overnight desk journalists had already filed their stories and the morning shift hadn't arrived yet. Someone had timed it carefully. Evelyn noticed this the moment she heard the knock, because noticing things carefully and quickly was the habit she'd spent a decade building and the last 14 months trying to forget. She'd been making coffee, French press, dark roast, the kind of small domestic ritual that she'd told her therapist, the cover story therapist, not the real one, represented her reintegration into civilian life. She heard the knock, registered the weight of it, the flat, bureaucratic knock of someone with a badge, and set down the coffee press without spilling a drop. She opened the door to 3 people. Detective Carl Maddox, a man she recognized immediately despite having never officially encountered him. 2 uniformed officers whose body language suggested they'd been briefed minimally and were slightly uncomfortable about that. And a warrant that was, on its surface, entirely legitimate looking. Evelyn Chun, Maddox said, already reaching for his cuffs. Yes, she said. You're under arrest for espionage in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 794, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 3 counts of unauthorized access to classified government systems. Evelyn looked at the warrant. She read it in approximately 4 seconds, which was about how long it took to confirm what she'd suspected for the past 11 days. That Kessler's people had finally moved, that the charges were fabricated with moderate competence, and that someone with actual resources had helped construct the legal architecture. The classified systems charges were the tell, specific enough to sound credible, vague enough to be almost impossible to disprove without disclosing information that was itself classified. Elegant, in a dirty sort of way. She put her hands out for the cuffs. "Can I finish my coffee?" she asked. Maddox blinked. He'd clearly been prepared for tears, or protests, or the kind of panicked bargaining that innocent people usually delivered. "No," he said, after a beat. "Shame," Evelyn said pleasantly. It was a good roast. She let them put on the cuffs. She let them walk her to the car. She looked straight ahead through the window as the city went by, doing the mental math she'd been quietly doing since she'd first noticed Kessler's surveillance 11 days ago, running the probabilities, accounting for the variables, and arriving at the same conclusion she'd arrived at 3 times already. She could end this. Immediately. 1 phone call. 2 at most. But ending it immediately would mean exposing channels that were still active, burning covers that were still operational, and potentially getting people killed. Real people, in real danger, people who trusted that the architecture of their protection would hold. So she would let it play out. For now, she leaned her head back against the car's seat, closed her eyes, and slept for the duration of the ride to the precinct. Not the shallow, anxious sleep of someone trying to escape their circumstances. The deep, controlled rest of someone who had learned, in a basement training facility in Northern Virginia, to sleep whenever and wherever a situation allowed, because you never knew when you'd next get the chance. She was still asleep when Maddox opened the door. He had to say her name twice. The public defender assigned to her was named Daniel Park, and he was, Evelyn decided within the first 3 minutes, genuinely good at his job and genuinely overwhelmed by his caseload. He was also, currently, staring at her across a metal table in a consultation room that smelled of industrial cleaner and anxiety, with the expression of a man who had read her file, and found it comprehensively unhelpful. "There's almost nothing here," he said, spreading the papers. "The charges are serious, but the evidence they've submitted is—" He paused. "Ms. Chun, do you have any prior legal representation? Any contacts in the legal community I should know about?" "No," she said. "Right." He wrote something down. "The prosecution is going to argue that you accessed classified government servers using credentials that weren't yours. They have server log records, they have a witness statement, and they have—" He paused again, longer this time. "They have a photograph of you meeting with a known foreign national at a coffee shop in Georgetown 3 weeks ago." Evelyn knew the photograph. She'd seen the man taking it. She'd allowed him to take it because she'd already identified him as Kessler's surveillance operative and had decided that interfering with the photograph would tip her hand prematurely. The meeting itself was a mundane coincidence. She'd sat at the only available table in a crowded cafe, next to a man who turned out to be a Bulgarian trade attaché she'd never met before and would likely never meet again. The photograph, cropped and contextualized correctly, looked like something it wasn't. "I understand," she said. "Ms. Chun." Daniel put down his pen. He had kind eyes, she noticed. The kind of eyes that still got tired rather than just blank. "I need you to help me help you. If you have any explanation for these meetings, any alibi for the system access dates, anything at all." "I know," she said gently. "I appreciate what you're doing. Please trust that I'm not making your job harder than it needs to be." He looked at her for a long moment. "The judge assigned to this case is Harlan Voss." She watched his face say the rest. "Which means we have a problem." "I know Judge Voss's reputation," she said simply. Daniel nodded slowly. He gathered his papers. He was too professional to say what he was thinking, which was that no amount of legal competence was going to be sufficient when the judge had already decided the outcome before the proceeding began. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Evelyn Chun was not relying on legal competence. She was relying on Marcus Webb's briefcase, and on the fact that Webb had told her, 11 days ago, that he would give her until the last possible moment, that he trusted her operational instincts, that if she hadn't made contact by the time the gavel came down, he would come himself. She believed him. She'd always believed Marcus Webb, because Marcus Webb had never once, in 9 years, been wrong about a timeline. Courtroom 14B of the D.C. Federal Courthouse was a room designed to communicate authority. The ceilings were high, the wood was dark. The seal of the federal judiciary looked down from behind the judge's bench with the permanent expression of something that had decided a long time ago it didn't need to justify itself. Evelyn walked in at 9:03 a.m. and sat down at the defense table with the same composure she brought to everything, settled, still, economical. She was wearing the second-hand blazer Daniel had gently suggested, over a white blouse, with her hair pulled back simply. She dressed down deliberately, though not for the reason people assumed. She dressed down because she wanted to be underestimated, and because being underestimated, in her experience, was the single most operationally useful state a person could occupy. She looked at the room, not nervously, not anxiously, but with the comprehensive methodical sweep of someone cataloging an environment. For exits including the one she'd entered, 22 people in the gallery. Press badges on 6 of them. She clocked Ryan Tate in the 3rd row immediately, disguised with a beard and glasses that were new since she'd last seen him, and she did not look at him for longer than she looked at anyone else. Security cameras in the corners, standard federal configuration, 30-second recording loops. 1 marshal at the door, 1 stationed near the witness box. She noted where CIA Director Webb would need to stand when he arrived. She noted the acoustics of the room. She folded her hands on the table, faced forward, and waited. The gallery murmured. She knew, not what they'd expected. The story that had leaked, carefully curated by Kessler's PR operation, framed her as a rogue analyst, a disgruntled contractor, a small, unstable person who had gotten above herself and been caught. The courtroom audience expected someone who looked frightened or defiant, someone performing either innocence or resentment. She was performing neither, and the absence confused them. Judge Harlan Voss entered at 9:17, and Evelyn studied him the way she studied everyone, comprehensively, without apparent interest. He was a tall man running to the softness of a sedentary decade, with the white hair and deliberate gravitas of someone who had been told he was impressive for so long he'd absorbed the information as fact. He had the kind of face that had probably been handsome at 40 and had curdled gradually into something self-satisfied and imprecise. His eyes moved to her immediately when he sat down, and she watched him do the same thing Maddox had done, look for fear, and find instead something he couldn't immediately categorize. She watched him decide, in real time, to interpret it as stupidity. That was fine. That was useful. The People versus Evelyn Chun, the clerk called. Sophia Reyes, Evelyn noted. Young. Careful. The precise way she held herself suggesting someone who had been in this courtroom long enough to have opinions about what went on here and was professional enough not to voice them. Prosecutor Graham Whitfield rose and delivered an opening that was polished and confident and built almost entirely on evidence that Evelyn knew had been manufactured. She listened to it the way a person might listen to a piece of music they know is technically accomplished but fundamentally hollow, appreciating the construction while being unmoved by it. Daniel did his best. His opening was honest, which was its main weakness in this room. He cited inconsistencies in the server logs, questioned the chain of custody on the surveillance photographs, and pointed out 3 separate procedural irregularities in the arrest warrant. It was good work. In a different courtroom, before a different judge, it might have mattered enormously. Voss interrupted him twice. The second time, Voss didn't bother disguising what he was doing as a procedural correction. He simply talked over Daniel, waved a hand, and moved on. A murmur ran through the gallery. Sophia Reyes's pen stopped moving for approximately 2 seconds. Evelyn noted this. Filed it. At the break, Daniel leaned toward her, his voice low and tight. He's not even pretending, he said. Ms. Chun, if you have anyone, now would be the time to. I know, she said quietly. You're doing very well. That's not what I know what you mean. She met his eyes, and whatever he saw there made him stop. Trust the process, she said. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who has just registered that they may not know as much about a situation as they thought. Then he sat back and said nothing more. The afternoon session was where Voss stopped playing subtle. The prosecution called its witness, a man named Thomas Greeley, a mid-level IT contractor who testified in a steady, rehearsed voice about log files he'd personally reviewed that showed unauthorized access from credentials linked to Evelyn Chun. His testimony was specific, technical, and almost entirely invented. Evelyn could see the seams in it the way a tailor can see uneven stitching. The timestamps were internally consistent, but inconsistent with metadata he hadn't mentioned. The access points described were real, but the access pattern described was not how a trained operative would ever behave, because it was sloppy in exactly the ways real operatives are never sloppy. Someone had written this testimony for a jury that didn't know what they didn't know, for a judge who didn't care. Daniel's cross-examination was precise and landed 3 genuine blows. Under different circumstances, Greeley would have been rattled. Under these circumstances, Voss sustained nearly every prosecution objection to Daniel's questions before Whitfield had even finished speaking them, and overruled Daniel's objections with the bored efficiency of a man who had already written the ending and was impatient to get there. Adrian Cole, Kessler's attorney, not formally involved in the prosecution but seated conspicuously in the front row of the gallery, watched these proceedings with the satisfied expression of a man attending a performance he'd paid for and was pleased to find meeting expectations. He was handsome in an aggressive, curated way, and he smiled too much. He caught Evelyn's eyes once, across the room, and she looked at him with the same calm, even focus she directed at everything, and he looked away first. He would tell himself later that he'd looked away for a different reason. People usually did. The second witness was Detective Carl Maddox, who testified about the arrest and described discovering, in Evelyn's apartment, a burner phone and a handwritten list of contact names that were allegedly linked to foreign intelligence services. The items had appeared in the evidence log 2 days after the arrest. Evelyn had not owned a burner phone. The list described bore a suspicious resemblance to documents Kessler's intelligence operation had circulated internally, as Evelyn happened to know, because she had read those documents as part of a surveillance operation 3 years ago. She listened to Maddox describe these items with the fluency of a prepared speaker, and she thought, 11 years. That's how long Voss has been on Kessler's payroll. The evidence is getting lazier because he doesn't need it to be good. He just needs it to exist. The realization that judicial corruption had reached a level of comfortable entropy, where the evidence didn't need to be convincing, just present, settled in her chest like a cold stone, and for the first time that day, she felt something other than professional patience. It was the particular kind of anger that she had always kept very precisely controlled. Deep, cold, and quiet. Burning without consuming. The kind of anger that doesn't make you louder, but makes everything you do more precise. She returned her hands to their folded position on the table. She looked at the clock. She waited. The defense. Voss said, with the tone of someone offering a formality. Daniel rose and argued as well as the room would allow. He challenged the chain of custody on the phone. He questioned the timing discrepancy in the evidence log. He cited precedent. He was, Evelyn thought, the best possible version of the advocate she'd been assigned, doing exactly what an advocate should do in a system that was supposed to work. Voss denied every motion, sustained every objection against Daniel before it was finished. At one point, visibly tiring of the formality, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Evelyn directly. "Ms. Chun," he said, in the tone of someone who has already made up their mind and is addressing the subject of their decision with performative patience. "You've had every opportunity to speak in your own defense. You've said nothing. I want you to understand that the court interprets your silence as—" "The court doesn't interpret silence as anything," Daniel said sharply. "The Fifth Amendment." "Sit down, Mr. Park." "Your Honor, I—" "Sit down." The courtroom was very quiet. Sophia Reyes's pen was motionless. The journalists in the back were writing hard. Voss looked at Evelyn again. "I've reviewed the evidence. I've heard the arguments. I'm prepared to rule." He reached for his gavel. And then he did what he'd been planning to do since Kessler's people first called him, 3 weeks ago. He leaned forward. He looked at the young woman in the second-hand blazer. And he smiled. A slow, deliberate smile that carried in it all the certainty of a man who had never once, in 11 years of these transactions, faced any consequence at all. "Lock this little B***tch up," he said. Not loudly, quietly, almost, just loud enough to carry. Just loud enough to be unmistakable. A full sentence, not a slip, not an ambiguity. The gallery erupted. Sophia Reyes flinched visibly. Daniel was on his feet, his voice raised, his face white with a kind of outrage that was entirely genuine. Adrian Cole, in the front row, was smiling. Evelyn didn't move. She looked at the clock. It read 3:28 p.m. She permitted herself the smallest, most private exhale. Right on time, she thought. In the 30 seconds between Judge Voss's words and the sound of the main courtroom doors opening, 30 seconds in which Daniel was shouting objections, the gallery was in various states of chaos, and Voss was raising his gavel with the confident weight of a man about to conclusively end something. Evelyn Chin's mind was not where anyone might have expected it to be. She was not thinking about the injustice of the proceedings, though she had catalogued every violation with clinical precision. She was not thinking about what came next, because she'd planned what came next in the hours between her arrest and her arraignment and had not revised the plan since, because the plan was sound. She was not thinking about Marcus Webb or Derek Kessler or the specific calculus of how many people would be arrested in the next 48 hours because of what was about to happen in this room. She was thinking about a morning in Bratislava, 6 years ago. She'd been 22 years old and 14 months into what her supervisors called her accelerated development program, and what she thought of privately as being systematically rebuilt. She'd been sitting in a safe house kitchen, waiting for extraction, with a bullet crease along her left ribs and a cup of terrible instant coffee, and Webb had walked in and sat across from her, and said, not encouragingly, not gently, but with the flat precision of someone imparting operational fact, "The most dangerous thing you'll ever be in any room is someone they can't read. Learn to be still. Everything else follows from that." She had taken that information seriously. She had been still for 6 years of operations that spanned 4 continents, 11 active conflicts, and approximately 30 situations in which her survival had depended on someone else failing to accurately assess her threat level. She had been still in interrogation rooms and boardrooms and dark corridors, and one genuinely terrible fishing boat in the Norwegian Sea. She had been still while men with more weapons and more resources and vastly more institutional authority than she possessed made the mistake that powerful people almost universally make, They saw what she let them see. She had been still in this courtroom for 6 hours. She thought. And this was perhaps the most honest thing she had felt all day, tired. Not frightened. Not angry, exactly. Just tired in the particular way that comes from spending significant time in rooms where things that should not be normal have been normalized, where the mechanics of justice have been so thoroughly corroded that the corroded version is now indistinguishable from the designed version to everyone inside it. She thought about Sofia Reyes's face, the flinch, the stopped pen, the expression of someone who had come to work intending to do her job correctly and had instead been made complicit in something that was wrong and had no mechanism to resist it. There were a lot of people like Sophia in the world. Good people, competent people, people who wanted the systems they worked within to function as advertised, who had no power against the ways those systems failed. That, more than anything else, more than Voss's corruption or Kessler's money or Adrian Cole's smile, was why she'd let this play out. Because dismantling the architecture that allowed a Harlan Voss to exist was not accomplished by one phone call. It required evidence, a record, a room full of witnesses and cameras, and people who would remember. It required a moment that could not be walked back or minimized or quietly resolved, a moment that would be written about and testified about and referenced in the investigations that came after. It required a performance, she thought, just not the one they thought they were putting on. Behind her, from the direction of the main courtroom doors, she heard the sound of footsteps. Plural, measured. The distinctive cadence of people who were not in a hurry because they did not need to be. People whose authority moved the room before they entered it. She heard the doors open. She did not turn around. She already knew exactly who was there. And from the sudden, complete silence that fell across the gallery, a silence different in quality from all the other silences that had occurred in this room today, a silence that had weight and direction to it, she knew that everyone else was about to find out. The footsteps crossed the courtroom in the specific silence that follows large, sudden surprises. The kind of silence where every person present is processing something faster than they can articulate it. CIA Director Marcus Webb was 68 years old, and he looked it in the way that certain people look their age when they have earned every year precisely. Lean, unhurried, with the particular bearing of someone who has spent decades in rooms where the stakes were high enough to either break posture or permanently correct it. He wore a dark suit that cost more than the public defender's monthly salary, and he carried a black briefcase, and behind him came 3 people, 2 in the conservative suits of federal officials and 1 in the uniform of a U.S. Marshal, and they moved through the gallery the way that authority, when it is real rather than performed, moves through a room, making space for itself without asking. Judge Voss had frozen mid-gavel. It was, Evelyn thought without looking at him, likely the first time in 11 years that he'd frozen at anything in this room. Webb walked to the front of the courtroom. He didn't look at Evelyn. He looked at the judge, and his expression was the expression of someone who has arrived to correct a significant error and is managing the process with the deliberate calm of a person who finds genuine anger wasteful. Director Webb. Voss had recovered a version of his authority, though it now had the quality of someone wearing a coat that no longer fit. This is a federal proceeding. You can't simply. I can, Webb said, pleasantly, not loudly. The acoustics of the room did the amplification. And I have. He set the briefcase on the prosecution table, which made Whitfield instinctively move sideways. Your Honor, I'm here as a witness and as a representative of the agency whose operations are directly implicated by the charges currently before this court. I have documentation that is directly relevant to your proceedings. The evidentiary record is closed, Voss said. If you have materials to submit, proper channels. The materials I'm submitting are classified at a level that proper channels cannot process, Your Honor. Webb opened the briefcase. He removed a black dossier, perhaps 2 inches thick, with a red diagonal stripe and a seal in the top right corner that made Graham Whitfield lean forward and then immediately lean back. They require judicial review under Title 50, Section 3024 of the U.S. Code, which gives the Director of National Intelligence, acting on my behalf, standing to present classified evidence before any federal court proceeding in which national security interests are implicated. He paused. The interests are significantly implicated. The courtroom was absolutely still. Voss stared at the dossier on the table. Something had changed in his face. The self-satisfaction had gone, and in its place was the particular expression of a man who has just seen something that doesn't fit the version of the situation he had been operating with. "What," he said carefully, "is this?" Webb picked up the dossier and walked toward the bench. He set it down in front of the judge with the unhurried precision of someone placing an object exactly where it needs to go. "This," he said, "is the classified file of the defendant, Evelyn Chun." He paused. "Her complete file, which is to say, her actual file." Another pause, calibrated for effect. "Her operational file." Silence. Voss looked at the dossier. He looked at the seal. He looked at Webb. "Operational," he repeated. His voice had changed. Something in the pronunciation was careful now, the way a person's voice becomes careful when they are starting to understand that they are standing in a place that has less ground under it than they thought. "Operational," Webb confirmed. "I'd invite you to open it, Your Honor. Start with the first tab." At the defense table, Daniel Park looked from Webb to Evelyn with an expression of total recalibration. He turned to her. She met his eyes briefly. She gave him the smallest, most minimal nod, the nod that means, "It's all right. I've got this now." Daniel sat down slowly, the expression of a man who has just understood that he has been, for the past 6 hours, standing next to a fire that knew it was a fire the entire time. Voss opened the dossier. In the front row of the gallery, Adrian Cole had stopped smiling. Voss read for 47 seconds before he looked up. He looked at Evelyn, then at Webb, then back at the dossier. "This," he started. "Page 3, Webb said, "covers her recruitment and early operational record. There's a summary of her first 3 field postings. I'd suggest you read page 7 before forming any conclusions." Voss turned to page 7. He read it. A vein in his temple, which had not previously been visible, became visible. "For the benefit of the court," Webb said, in the tone of a professor who has decided that simply explaining is more efficient than waiting for students to catch up, "I'll provide a brief summary of what that file contains." He turned to face the gallery, which was the decision of a very specific kind of communicator, someone who knew that the moment needed witnesses and was deliberately creating them. The defendant, Evelyn Chun, was recruited by the Central Intelligence Agency at the age of 19, following performance assessments that placed her in the top 0.2% of the program's history. She completed the Black Division's accelerated training protocol, the first woman to do so in under 18 months, and entered active operations at age 21. The scratching of journalists' pens in the back was audible. In her operational capacity, Webb continued, Ms. Chun served as field lead on Operation Meridian, which resulted in the dismantling of the Red Meridian Arms Network across 7 Eastern European countries and the arrest of 31 individuals, including 2 sitting officials of foreign governments who had diplomatic immunity and were successfully prosecuted anyway through mechanisms Ms. Chun herself designed. He let that settle. She was 23. Voss had stopped reading the dossier. He was very still. At 25, she served as operational architect of Operation Voronov, which dismantled the Voronov cartel, at the time the largest active weapons trafficking organization operating in the former Soviet states. Total interdictions in that operation, 47. Estimated weapons diverted from active conflict zones, enough to have substantially prolonged 3 separate regional conflicts, by DoD analysis. Webb turned a page in the dossier he'd apparently memorized. She did that primarily alone, over 14 months, under 3 separate cover identities, in 4 countries, none of which she had previously operated in. Adrian Cole, in the front row, was looking at the back of Evelyn's head. His face had the expression of a man who has just been handed information that is rearranging something fundamental about how he understood a situation, and who is not yet sure what the rearranged version means for him personally. He was beginning to suspect the answer was nothing good. At 27, Webb said, Ms. Chun was appointed director of the Black Division, the youngest director in the division's history, and the first woman to hold the position. In that capacity, she oversaw Operation Blackwater. He paused. Blackwater is still classified above the clearance level of most of the people in this room, so I won't speak to specifics. I'll simply note that its successful conclusion, 18 months ago, represented the single largest coordinated counterarms trafficking operation in the agency's history. It is not an overstatement to say that its results prevented events that DoD modeling suggested would have caused tens of thousands of civilian casualties across multiple conflict regions. The courtroom had the quality of a room where everyone present has forgotten they are doing anything other than listening. Webb picked up the dossier from the bench. Voss did not stop him, did not appear capable of stopping him, and opened it to a page marked with a red tab. "There is also," he said, "a section in this dossier that I'd like to draw the court's specific attention to. Tab 7. It concerns the Kessler Syndicate." In the front row, Adrian Cole stood up. "Your Honor," he said. "Sit down, Mr. Cole," Webb said, without looking at him. The words carried the specific weight of a person who is not asking. Cole sat down. He sat down the way a person sits down when their legs have made the decision before their brain has caught up. Tab 7, Webb continued, contains 3 years of ghost designation intelligence on the Kessler Syndicate's operations, including financial transactions, personnel, operational structure, and, notably, a comprehensive record of payments made to certain individuals in institutional positions. He let the sentence end there. He let the implications of certain individuals in institutional positions stand in the room without elaborating, because he was very good at his job, and he knew that what a person's imagination fills in is always more devastating than what you tell them directly. Voss's face had gone a color that Sophia Reyes would later describe, in her statement to federal investigators, as the color of someone who has just understood that they are not going to be able to leave this room the way they came in. "Your Honor," Webb said, and his voice now carried something different. Not the lecturing patience of the last 5 minutes, but a precision that was sharper. "The charges against Ms. Chun are fabricated. The evidence is manufactured. The witness testimony was coached. The server logs were altered by Detective Carl Maddox in consultation with a data contractor employed by the Kessler Syndicate." He paused. "We have documentation of all of it. We've had documentation of all of it for 9 days. Another pause. Careful, measured. "We waited to present it here, in this room, in this manner, at Ms. Chin's specific request." Every head in the gallery turned to look at Evelyn. She was sitting exactly as she had been sitting for 6 hours. Hands folded, back straight, expression composed. She looked at no one in particular, at nothing in particular. Then she turned, very slightly, and looked at Judge Harlan Voss. And she looked at him, quietly and entirely, with the accumulated weight of someone who had sat in this room for 6 hours and watched, and listened, and waited, and known, the entire time, exactly what this moment would feel like when it arrived. Voss looked away first. What happened next took 11 minutes, and was, by any neutral measure, the most efficiently executed institutional dismantling that the Marshal's Service could remember facilitating in a federal courthouse. The U.S. Marshal who had entered with Webb moved first, not dramatically, but with the practiced economy of someone executing a process rather than performing one. He approached the bench. He placed a document in front of Voss, a document that Voss did not read, because Voss's capacity for the kind of authoritative self-possession that had defined his 11 corrupt years on the bench had entirely vacated the premises. The document was a federal arrest warrant. It had been signed by a district judge who was not Harlan Voss at 2:15 that afternoon. "Your Honor," the marshal said, with the politeness of someone who is about to do a difficult thing and is being professional about it, "I need you to step down from the bench." "This is..." Voss's voice was not working correctly. He cleared his throat. Started again. "This is unprecedented." "It is not, Your Honor," the marshal said. "The precedent is from 1987. Judge Albert Reyes, Southern District of Florida. I can provide the citation if that would be helpful." Voss looked at the warrant. He looked at the gallery, at Adrian Cole, who was looking back at him with the expression of a man who had just mentally severed any connection to the person he was looking at, the way a lawyer separates themselves from a client when the client becomes a liability. At the journalists, who were writing so fast their pens were barely keeping contact with paper. At Sophia Reyes, who was holding her own document folder against her chest like a shield, and who was, for the first time all day, allowing herself to look directly at the judge who employed her, with an expression that was not one of her professional expressions at all. Voss stepped down from the bench. He did it the way that powerful men, stripped of their power, almost always do the physical things, with a kind of bewildered mechanical compliance, as though the body will follow instructions that the mind is still refusing to process. He stepped down, and the marshal guided him, gently and firmly, toward the side door. The gallery erupted. Webb turned to the second federal official who had come in with him, a woman in her 40s who introduced herself to the room simply as Deputy Director Marsh, DOJ Criminal Division, and who then, in a voice that cut cleanly through the gallery noise, addressed the room. I have federal arrest warrants for the following individuals currently present in this courtroom, she said. She held up a document and read from it. Adrian Cole, attorney, on charges of conspiracy to obstruct justice, coordination with a criminal enterprise, and violations of federal anti-racketeering statutes. She looked up. Mr. Cole, please remain seated. Cole had, in fact, been attempting to stand. He sat back down. His face was doing something complicated. Detective Carl Maddox, she continued, on charges of evidence fabrication, obstruction of justice, perjury before a federal court, and coordination with a criminal enterprise. From the witness area, Maddox made a sound. Two marshals moved toward him. Thomas Greeley, on charges of perjury before a federal court. Greeley, who had long since left the witness box and was attempting to locate the exit, was stopped by a marshal who had apparently been stationed exactly there for precisely this reason. And, Marsh said, and here her voice had the quality of someone delivering the last note of a piece and holding it properly. We have a warrant for Derek Allen Kessler on a federal indictment covering 47 counts of arms trafficking, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of international arms control statutes. Mr. Kessler is currently in the building. He arrived 90 minutes ago and is in a conference room on the third floor, where he was informed he was attending a settlement discussion. She looked up from the document. He was not informed he was attending a settlement discussion with federal agents. In the third row of the gallery, Ryan Tate took off his glasses and folded them into his pocket. He caught Evelyn's eyes and, for the first time, allowed a small, real smile to cross his face. The particular smile of someone who spent a great deal of time in extremely high-stakes situations and had learned that showing any feeling was a choice, and was choosing, in this specific moment, to show this one. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Then she looked forward again. But something in her composure had shifted, not collapsed, not broken, but softened slightly, in the way that things do when the enormous, sustained effort of maintaining them can finally be eased. Daniel Park was sitting beside her, not writing, not speaking, simply existing in the specific silence of someone who has just watched the entire context of a situation invert. He turned to her slowly. He appeared to be attempting to formulate a sentence and finding the usual architecture of sentences inadequate. Ms. Chun, he finally said. It's Evelyn, she said. Given everything. Evelyn. He stopped. Started again. I want to say I'm sorry that I didn't. You did everything right, she said. I mean that. Everything I asked of you, you did. And everything the system asked of you, you did better. She paused and said the next thing with a precision that made it land properly. You should know that there are going to be a lot of people in a lot of rooms over the next several months reviewing what happened in this courtroom today. Your conduct is going to be in that review. Every word of it. She let him understand what she meant. You'll be fine. He nodded slowly. He looked as though he might say more, then thought better of it, then said it anyway. What are you, actually? She picked up her bag from under the defense table. She stood. I was a translator, she said. I'm retired. The rest happened the way these things happen when the machinery of justice has been properly engaged and is running the way it was designed to, loudly, bureaucratically, and with the gathering momentum of a process that has been stalled for a long time and is now moving. Federal agents entered the building. Kessler's conference room meeting on the third floor ended somewhat differently than he had been led to expect. Maddox and Greeley were processed through the system in the way that people who have spent careers within a system being processed are particularly ill-equipped to cope with. Cole, who had lawyers, very good lawyers, the kind of lawyers who did not consult with the client before assuming the worst, because the lawyers were also very good at reading rooms, said nothing from the moment of his arrest. Senator Patricia Holloway, who had been watching a live stream of the proceedings from her office and who had spent 3 weeks publicly questioning why a woman with no prior record and no legal representation was facing federal espionage charges with no opportunity for bail review, issued a statement from her office at 4:47 p.m. that was 6 paragraphs long and did not pull a single punch. The statement went, within hours, to approximately 14 million people. Sofia Reyes gave her statement to federal investigators at 5:30 p.m. She had, it turned out, been keeping notes, carefully, privately, in a small notebook she kept in her desk for reasons she had not entirely articulated to herself, for 3 years. The notes were precise and dated and constituted a detailed observational record of judicial conduct in courtroom 14B that investigators would later describe, in internal communications, as unexpectedly comprehensive. Sofia Reyes was offered, 2 months later, a position with the DOJ's Judicial Integrity Office. She accepted it. Marcus Webb found Evelyn in the corridor outside the courtroom at 4:22 p.m., sitting on a bench with her bag beside her and a cup of coffee from the courthouse vending machine. Terrible coffee, the institutional kind, the kind that comes out with a thin film on top, held in both hands. He sat down beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything. This was normal for them. They had always been comfortable with silences, which was one of the many reasons they'd worked well together. 9 days, he finally said. I needed the record, she said. I know. He paused. You could have pulled the thread earlier. Avoided the arrest entirely. I know. You could have called me the moment Kessler's surveillance showed up. I know. She sipped the terrible coffee. But if I had, we'd have Maddox and maybe Cole. A few low-level Kessler assets. And Kessler himself would have been offshore before the ink dried on the warrants. She paused. This way, we have everything. The financial records, the judge, the lawyer, the cop, the syndicate head, all in the same building on the same afternoon, all documented. She looked at her coffee. It needed to play out. Webb was quiet for a moment. It was a risk. Everything is a risk. She looked at him sideways. You knew I could handle it. I knew, he agreed. Then what are you actually asking me? He considered. I'm asking if you're all right. She looked at that question the way she looked at most things. Carefully, honestly, without the deflection that was easier. Was she all right? She had spent 9 days being surveilled, 1 day being arrested and processed and publicly mocked and called, by a federal judge in open court, a slur she was fairly certain would be quoted in the header of approximately every news article written about this case for the next 6 months. She had sat for 6 hours in a room and been still while things happened around her that she found, personally, privately, beneath the professional surface, genuinely enraging. She had also, in the same afternoon, watched a corrupt judge be walked out of his own courtroom. Watched a syndicate 11 years in the making begin to come apart. Watched a court clerk's 3 years of careful notes become evidence. Watched Daniel Park do his job with full integrity against a system that had been designed to defeat him and not be defeated. Yes, she said. And then, with slightly more honesty, mostly. Webb nodded. He stood up, straightened his jacket. When this is over, the testimony, the investigations, all of it, are you coming back? She looked at the corridor, the marble floor, the seal on the far wall, the ordinary and extraordinary machinery of institutions that were supposed to mean something and mostly did, and sometimes catastrophically didn't. No, she said. He wasn't surprised. Good coffee recommendation in Georgetown. Place called Alborough, on P Street. They do a very good dark roast. She looked at him. I know, he said. I know about the coffee press. She almost smiled. He walked back toward the courtroom, toward the organized noise of accountability being distributed, and she sat for another moment in the corridor, holding the terrible vending machine coffee in both hands. Then she finished it. She stood up. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the exit, and the marble corridor took her footsteps and carried them, and the doors ahead of her opened into the late afternoon of a March day that was, at this specific moment, unremarkable and beautiful and full of the particular quality of air that cities have in the hour after something significant happens, a kind of hell-breath clarity, as if the city itself is processing. Evelyn Chin walked out of the courthouse. She descended the steps. She turned left on the sidewalk. She did not look at the cameras. She did not give a statement. She did not call anyone. She walked 4 blocks to a cafe, not Alborough, which she'd find later, sat in the corner, ordered a dark roast, and read a novel she'd been halfway through for 3 weeks and hadn't had time to finish. The novel was unremarkable. The coffee was good, for the first time in 9 days. She found she could concentrate on something small and quiet and entirely without consequence. She turned a page. She stayed. 3 weeks later, a journalist writing the definitive account of the Voss proceedings, a piece that would win 2 awards and result in a congressional inquiry into judicial corruption at the federal level, reached a part of her research that she hadn't expected to reach, a question of who Evelyn Chin actually was. The journalist was thorough. She filed FOIA requests. She contacted sources at the CIA, the DoD, the DOJ. She reached out to Ryan Tate, who replied from an email address that bounced within 24 hours. She obtained the arrest records, the court transcripts, the evidence logs. She built a comprehensive picture of what had happened in courtroom 14B with the painstaking architectural precision of a person who believed that the truth was a thing that could be assembled from its pieces. The piece she eventually published ran 12,000 words. It covered Voss's corruption in forensic detail. It covered Kessler's syndicate and the network of institutional actors who'd enabled it. It covered Daniel Park's defense, Sophia Reyes's notes, and the moment the courtroom doors opened and CIA Director Webb walked in. It mentioned Evelyn Chun in every place she was relevant, which was, given that she was the center of the story, frequently. It described what she was seen doing, what she was recorded saying, what she was known to have done after she left the courthouse. On the question of who she actually was, where she had worked before her NGO position, what she had done before she became a translator, what her background was, what the file in the black dossier contained in full, the piece had a gap. Not an evasion. A genuine absence. The journalist was honest about it in the text. Evelyn Chin's history prior to her employment with the NGO could not be verified through available public records. Multiple requests to the CIA for comment on Director Webb's testimony regarding her operational history received the same response. We cannot confirm or deny the operational status or history of the individual in question. It was, the journalist wrote, the only part of the story she couldn't tell. Elsewhere in the city, in a specific cafe on P Street that had been recommended to her by someone who knew her coffee preferences well enough that she'd stopped being surprised he was right about things, a woman in a plain jacket sat in a corner booth with a dark roast and a book she was, this time, actually making progress on. She had given testimony to federal investigators. She had cooperated with the DOJ inquiry, within the parameters of what she was permitted to disclose. She had been informed that she might be called to testify in the trials of Voss, Kessler, and Cole, and had been told this by a federal prosecutor who delivered the information with the slightly careful tone of someone who wasn't entirely sure they were in a position to compel her to do anything. She had replied that she would be available, gave her contact information, and thanked them for their time. She had not been on the news. She had not given interviews. She had not, as far as anyone could tell, registered the fact that her name and face had been on the front page of 3 major national newspapers with some variation of the phrase, "Mystery CIA Operative," in the headline. She turned a page. At the next table, a man in his early 30s sat down with his own coffee and unfolded a newspaper. He read for a few minutes. Then he said, without looking up, "They're calling you a mystery." "I heard," she said. 7 different publications have tried to find your apartment." "I heard that too." He turned another page of the newspaper. "Webb's recommending you for the Intelligence Medal." "Classified ceremony, obviously." She didn't say anything. "You'd have to show up for it," he said. "In person. Probably a room. People. I'm aware of how ceremonies work. Just checking." He folded the newspaper. He picked up his coffee. He finally looked at her. Ryan Tate looked the same as he'd looked in the courtroom gallery. The beard he'd grown for the cover. The eyes that were always doing more than they appeared to. "What are you actually going to do?" he asked. "Long term." She thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, in the way she'd been allowing herself to think about things since that afternoon in the corridor. Less analytically, more honestly. "Read," she said. "Get better at cooking. Maybe travel somewhere that no one needs me to do anything when I arrive." She paused. "Sleep longer than 5 hours." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she recognized. The expression of someone who has worked beside a person for years in circumstances that don't allow for the usual textures of friendship, and is now in ordinary daylight, and doesn't quite know what to do with the version of that person who gets to just be a person. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. They drank their coffee in the comfortable silence of people who had spent enough time in genuinely unpleasant circumstances together that silence required no management. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary rhythms. The marble of the federal courthouse was still gleaming 8 blocks away. The machinery of accountability was still running, slowly, imperfectly, loudly, the way it always does. And somewhere in that machinery, a corrupt judge was facing disbarment. A syndicate head was facing 47 counts, a court clerk was preparing for a new job, and a public defender was being interviewed by the DOJ Office of Professional Responsibility, who wanted to put his work that afternoon into the formal record as an example of what the public defense system was capable of when its people were given the room to do it properly. Evelyn Shin finished her coffee. She ordered another. She opened her book to page 187, which was where she'd left off. She was not in any database. She was on no list. She appeared in no public record. Somewhere in Langley, in a vault that required 3 separate clearances to access, there was a black dossier with a red diagonal stripe that contained a record of things she had done and the assessment of what she was. And that dossier, when the proper officials reviewed it with the proper clearances, said the same thing on its summary page that it had always said. Threat assessment, maximum. Recommended response, do not engage. Do not obstruct. Do not underestimate. Below that, in Webb's handwriting, in the margin, was a single addition that had been added 14 months ago, when she'd retired, and that was not part of the official document. She's the best thing we ever built. Let her rest. Evelyn turned a page, and the city turned around her, and the afternoon light came through the cafe window at the particular angle that means late afternoon and the shift from one kind of day into another, and she was, for the first time in a very long time, just a woman in a coffee shop, reading a book. The ghost, for the moment, had come home.